So I saw your photos earlier, Frankie. You look lovely. I think I just came into the chat when you were just talking about it, actually.
Should I do it to my needle?
Oh, it was so.
Yeah.
It was
Probably the same thing that you did with the other one when you lost that.
No, I fucking missed it.
Did you have marshmallows, or what did you have? Or did you just make a phone?
I did some chocolate stuffed baked bananas, and some like roast potatoes, garlic, and onion.
Lovely.
Like a little packet with oregano and
Oh, Frankie.
nice. And I had a hip flask full of port because I'm a fancy bitch, and I got mildly tooty in the sunshine on port from a hip flask. Very
But you took a lot of water as well.
I took an entire bottle of iced tea.
Okay.
And yeah, it was lush. So I've got big plans for what I'm going to cook tomorrow. Big
Yeah.
plans. Yeah.
Like a whole cow?
Not like a whole cow. Sadly, not a whole cow. But I've got some padron peppers that I'm gonna cook in oil and have with salt. Might do a pizza. Probably some more stuffed bananas. Maybe roast apple. And spend the whole day cooking everything, cooking as much food
People
as I can
drift
carry.
towards you. Let's go. Beat them off with a stick. Get back.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep me 2 meters.
Away. So yeah, it's going to be good. What's everyone else been up to today?
Nick planted 44 potatoes.
Wowzers!
And dug the bed for them.
Gradually removing clothing. It was very exciting. I would come downstairs after working for an hour, and there would be another item of clothing hanging on the washing line.
Yeah.
Ooh. Was he bollock naked by the end?
Well, obviously.
Dressed in only a potato. Typically placed potatoes.
It's
a different joke about potatoes.
Is it part of a kind of an arcane fertility ritual by which you kind of encourage the potatoes to grow by just gradually removing more and more clothing?
You gotta fertilise the bastards somehow, right?
Hi, Kim. Hi, Kim. Who else have we got? Oh, we've got loads of people. Oh, we've got loads of people. Hi, Malcolm. Hi, Andrada. Hi, Martin. Hi. Kitty and Rory are here.
Yo.
Buddy. Yo. Oh, God, I love those. I love those hot cuts so much. So good.
Nick, I just wanted to say that I appreciated your joke, even though very few other people laughed. It was filthy. It was great.
Thank you.
Do not approve. Malcolm, what are you drinking tonight, my love?
Gin. No,
I'm so glad to hear it.
The very excitingly coloured bottle that I had the other
The
time.
Fireheart.
The Fireheart one, yeah.
Fireheart, of course.
I do hands fucking name.
Yeah. It's spicy, so it is appropriate.
Stuff.
Very nice. Very nice.
Kim, how did games go earlier?
Oh yeah, they're pretty good. It was just still ongoing. I ran away to join this. Yep. Yeah. This like it was I think there were ended up being like 6 people pretty much at all times, but it's usually like one person would join towards the end of the game, another person would drop out, and it would be all nice and even numbers and perfect for gameplay.
That's very nice.
Actually, it's the first time I've ever used Discord, so I'm a bit of a newbie there.
Yeah. It's weird. Like, is there anyone who really feels like they use it like a lot effectively? Because I'm in about 4 different Discord channels, but I very rarely use them still. I don't know. I mean, apart from when I'm playing an online game,
Yeah.
almost never.
I've used it for D&D, but that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we tried to use it for D&D, to just fail miserably. Like we couldn't make it work. So I think we just used Zoom in the end.
I think Zoom's good because you got the option of the video anyway. I mean, I like Discord, but we noticed even just there were a lot of communication issues because people couldn't quite understand each other's accents. So it happens when you have like 4 different accents on the one call. It's like playing like code names, so you have to like pronounce all the words in order to find the associated ones. Yeah, and it's like, so Trevor's running it, so he's Canadian, and Carmen, so Spanish. We've got Irish, so Iris, who's got French accent. Then there's me, which is whatever, and Andreas and Andrea, German. It's like
That's cool. What a smorgasbord of accents.
spell it out. Everything.
That sounds excellent.
Yeah.
Martin, how was your first day of freedom?
Freedom tasted pretty good. I went for a nice bike ride and then I came back and I had a beer with my
What measure?
First day of freedom?
You've been self-isolated.
Oh, I didn't.
Yes, I've been isolating for the last 7 days, and my household get to isolate for another 7 days in case my minor cold was not a minor cold.
All right.
Did you have the virus then?
I mean, I had a fever for 2 days, very mild,
okay.
like all the mild colds that I've had in my life, but maybe COVID-19.
Glad you're feeling better.
Managed to dig your way out under the walls with a spoon.
I did. It was a very trusty spoon.
Everyone needs a trusty spoon.
Yes, they do.
I hope it was a runcible spoon.
Yes, exactly. Was it a Storytime spoon?
Obviously.
So confusing to find Biscoff paste and
Hello?
I was just trying to wangle Biscoff paste into the story.
Biscoff paste.
You turned it in the
Requires
wall.
no wangling. Just drop it right in there.
Classically, you like dig a hole in a wall and then you put a poster over it so nobody notices you're digging a hole in it. Instead of that's too obvious. You just dig a hole in the wall and then you smear Biscoff paste across the hole. Like, why do you got a big patch of Biscoff paste on your wall? And you're like, why don't you have a big patch of Biscoff paste on your wall? And there's an answer to that.
Or you have like a kind of sort of sexy pin-up style poster of a tub of Biscoff paste, like kind of sort of softly lit with the light glinting off the curves of the jar.
Mm-hmm.
I can't actually buy any because they don't sell it in any of the shops within walking distance.
Oh no!
I'm almost out. I don't know what I'm going to do.
Shall I get a jar and send it up to you?
I mean, that would be very kind, but wouldn't you
We
go
have
to
a post office. I have been to the post office in my time.
They can go out now.
Oh yeah, you're allowed out.
Next time I'm at Sainsbury's, I'll pick you up a jar of Biscoff paste and send it up to you.
Thank you.
I have a question. Has anyone ever tried making Biscoff paste into a cocktail? I feel like this could be amazing. Like with whiskey or something, maybe.
I put it in a hot chocolate, which obviously does not a cocktail make.
But this still sounds pretty good.
I had it in my porridge this morning, and that was fucking delicious.
What are you talking about?
Biscoff paste.
Ooh, nice.
So delicious.
I bought a Biscoff paste Rocky Road bar from a cafe. Sat in the park with coffee and ate it in the sun.
Yeah. Question.
I've never.
Will I get chucked out of the group if I admit that I've never had Biscoff paste? I don't really know what you're all talking about.
It's okay if you haven't had. If you'd said that you didn't like it, it would have been instant block. But if you've never had it, that's okay. I hadn't had it, but now I have, and I'll never be the same again.
And your life's much better now.
My life is so
Okay.
better. Maybe
I
I'll.
never heard of it before story time.
Oh my god! Shall I next
We
time?
have
I'm
no
in
idea
Shall I
either.
just pick up?
Happy birthday, Michael.
Shit ton? Is Michael here? Michael, happy birthday!
Happy birthday, Michael! Big hug!
Birthday hugs.
I'll turn you upside down.
Oh, oh, oh.
What
Sit
you like?
down. I have, yeah, yeah, I went for a walk with Oha and we found kittens.
Hey.
Very nice.
And she was saying, got done, got done, got done, got done, got done. Yeah, it was great.
Excellent. She knows the appropriate way to deal with kittens. You need to get them. You have to get them. Michael, are you sticking around for the story, or will you be back for the after chat, or is this the only point at which you are going to be
I
around?
might be back for the after chat.
Awesome. So, would you be happy to have your birthday poem in the after chat?
Yeah.
If that would still be cool, Malcolm, are you still happy to do jabber your walk?
Yes.
Right. It's
Story time.
I think it's story time, you guys.
Carmen was asking, could you just wait a minute or two?
Yeah, no, just 1 minute from now. So I was just going to stall you by talking like this for a minute.
Go
Or
for it.
Right,
Hey.
no, actually, it's 10 past now. You can go for it.
Should I just go for it? Wait, we will wait till Carmen is back. So, yeah, I guess do you want to stall away? Do you want to talk about Biscoff paste a bit more, Malcolm? Do you want to say the words? Can't say the words.
It was a summer market, and I had a stall, by which I was stalling on the stall, and on the stall I had a market stall of nothing but jars of Biscoff paste.
You have taste, sir. You have taste.
Here, ready.
Hey, you made it. Just in time.
What the heck actually is it?
What was the question, sorry?
I said, what the heck actually is it?
Have you ever had those little biscuits with coffee that are rectangular and come free?
Yes.
It's like them, but in
Furry
paste.
version of that. Does it just taste like it, or does it have like a biscuity kind of texture?
No, it just tastes like it. It has the texture of Nutella.
Oh, okay, yum.
So good.
There's also the crunchy version, which has actual crumbs of biscuit in it.
Lisa's wide eyes say that.
That is good to know.
It's much harder to get hold of, though.
Oh, that's the one I found here.
Like the original Iron Brew.
Yeah.
You'd have to know who to know.
Story time.
Right. Now. Okay. Gird your loins, everyone. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 25. We wrapped ourselves in torn cloaks we took off the dead guards and ran for it, our hems leaving streaks of blood on the floor behind us. I had shoved Alosha's sword back into its strange waiting place, Hatol opening a pocket in the world for me to put it in. Kasha carried the little girl, and I held Stashek's hand. We went down a tower staircase, past a landing where two men in a hallway glanced over at us, puzzled and frowning. We hurried on down another turning, fast, and came into the narrow hallway to the kitchens, servants going back and forth. Stashek tried to pull back from me. "I want my father," he said, his voice trembling. I want Uncle Marek. Where are we going? All I knew was we had to get away. The wood had scattered too many seeds all around us. They'd lain quiet in fallow ground, but now they were all coming to fruit. Nowhere was safe when corruption lived in the king's castle. The princess had meant to take them to her parents, to Gidner on the Northern Sea. The ocean is inimical to corruption, Alosha had said. But trees still grew in Gidner, and the wood would pursue the children to the shore. To the tower, I said. I didn't plan on saying it. The words came out of me like Stashek's cry. I wanted the stillness of Sarkhan's library, the faint spice and sulphur smell of his laboratory, those close, narrow hallways, the clean lines and the emptiness, the tower standing tall and lonely against the mountains. The wood had no foothold there. We're going to the Dragon's Tower. Some of the servants were slowing. Look, man called down with authority. You there! Hold on to me, I told Kasha. I put my hand on the castle wall and whispered us through, straight out into the kitchen gardens, one staring gardener kneeling up from the dirt. I ran between rows of beanstakes with Stashek wide-eyed running with me, catching out fear. Kasha ran beside us. We reached the outer wall of heavy brick. I took us through. The castle bells began to clang alarm behind us as we scrambled in a hail of dirt all the way down the steep slope to the Vandalus running deep below. The river rushed quick and deep here around the castle, leaving the city behind, going east. A hunting bird cried high above, a falcon wheeling in wide circles around the castle. Was that Solya looking down at us? I snatched up a handful of reeds from the bank without any incantations or charms. They had all gone out of my head cloak and tied the reeds at two ends. I threw the bundle down on the bank, halfway in the water, and flung magic at it. It grew into a long, light boat, and we scrambled in even as the river tugged it off the bank and dragged us along, rushing, bouncing off rocks on either side. There were shouts behind us, guards appearing on the outer walls of the castle high above. Down! Kasha shouted and pushed the children down flat and covered them with her body. The guards were firing arrows at us. One tore through her cloak and hit her back. Another landed just beside me and stuck into the side of the boat, quivering. I snatched the feathers off the arrow shaft and threw them up into the air above us. They remembered what they'd once been and turned into a cloud of half birds that whirled and sang, covering us from view for a few moments. I held on to the sides of the boat and called up Yaga's quickening charm. We shot forward. In one lurch, the castle and the city blurred back and away, turned into children's toys. In a second, they had vanished around a curve of the river. In a third, we struck on the empty riverbank. My boat of reeds fell apart around us and dumped us all into the water. I nearly sank. The weight of my clothes dragged me backward, down into the murky water, light blurring above me. The cloud of Kasha's skirts billowed next to me. I thrashed for the surface, blindly grabbing, and found a small hand grabbing back. Stashek put my hand on a tree root. I pulled myself up, coughing, and managed to put my feet down in the water. Nyashka! Kasha was calling. She was holding Marisha in her arms. We slogged up the soft, muddy bank, Kasha's feet sinking deep with every step, gouging holes in the earth that filled slowly in with water behind her. I sank down on the mucky grass. I was trembling with magic that wanted to spill out of me in every direction, uncontrolled. We'd moved too quickly. My heart was racing, still back there under the raining arrows, still in desperate flight, and not on a quiet, deserted riverbank with water bugs jumping over the ripples we'd made, mud staining my skirts. I'd been so long inside the castle, people and stone walls everywhere. The riverbank almost didn't seem real. Stashek sat down in a heap next to me, his small, serious face bewildered, and Marisha crept over to him and huddled against him. He put an arm around her. Kasia sat down on their other side. I could gladly have lain down and slept for a day, a week. But Marek knew which way we'd gone. Solia would send eyes down the river to look for us. There was no time to rest. I shaped a pair of crude oxen out of riverbank and breathed a little life into them and built a cart out of twigs. We hadn't been an hour on the road when Kasia said, "Yeshka," looking behind us, and I drove them quickly into a stand of trees some way back from the road. A small haze of dust was drifting up from the road behind us. I held the reins, the oxen standing with plodding obedience, and we all held our breath. The cloud grew unnaturally fast. It came nearer and nearer, and then a small troop of red-cloaked riders with crossbows and bared swords went flashing past. Sparks of magic were striking from the horses' hooves, shod in steel caps that rang like bells on the hard-packed road. Some work of Alosha's hands, now being turned to serve the wood. I waited until the cloud was out of sight again up ahead before I drove our cart back onto the road. When we drew into the first town, we found signs already posted. They were crudely, hastily drawn, a long parchment with my face and Kasia's upon it, pinned to a tree next to the church. I hadn't thought what it meant to be hunted. I'd been glad to see the town, planning to stop and buy food. Our stomachs were pinching with hunger. Instead, we pulled the cloaks over our heads and rolled onward without speaking to anyone. My hands shook on the reins all the way through, but we were lucky. It was market day and the town was large, so close to the city. There were enough strangers around that no one marked us out or demanded to see our faces. As soon as we were past the buildings, I shook the reins and hurried the oxen onward, quicker, until the village disappeared entirely behind us. We had to pull off the road twice more, packs of horsemen flying past. And then once more late that evening, when another king's messenger in his red cloak passed us going the other way, racing back towards Kralia, hoof sparks bright in the dimming light. He didn't see us, intent on his fast pace. We were just a shadow behind a hedge. While we were hiding, I caught sight of something dark and square behind us. It was the open doorway of an abandoned cottage, half lost in a stand of trees. While Kasia held the oxen, I hunted through the overgrown garden. A handful of late strawberries, some old turnips, onions, a few beans. We gave the children most of the food, and they fell asleep in the cart as we drove back onto the road. At least our oxen didn't need to eat or rest, being made out of dirt. They would march on all night long. Kasia climbed onto the driver's seat with me. The stars had come out in a rush, the sky wide and dark, so far away from anyone living. The air was cold, still, too quiet. The cart didn't creak and the oxen didn't huff or snort. "You haven't tried to send word to their father?" Kasia said quietly. I stared ahead down the dark road. "He's dead too," I said. "The Rossians ambushed him." Kasia carefully took my hand, and we held on to each other as the cart rocked onward. After a little while, she said, "The princess died next to me. She put the children in the wardrobe and then she stood in front of it. They stabbed her over and over, and she just kept trying to stand up in front of the doors." Her voice shook. "Yeshka, can you make a sword for me?" I didn't want to. Of course, it was only sensible to give her one in case we were caught. I didn't fear for her. Kasia would be safe enough fighting when blades just went dull on her skin and arrows fell away without scratching her. But she would be dangerous and terrible with a sword. She wouldn't need a shield or armor or even to think. She could walk through fields of soldiers like cutting oats, steady and rhythmic. I thought of Alosha's sword, that strange, hungry, killing thing. It was tucked away into that magical pocket, but I could still feel its weight on my back. Kasha would be like that sword, implacable, but she wouldn't only have one use. I didn't want her to need to do things like that. I didn't want her to need a sword. It was a useless thing to want. I took out my belt knife and she gave me hers. I pulled the buckles off our belts and our shoes and the pins off our cloaks and took a stick off a tree as we passed it and gathered all of it together in my skirt. While Kasha drove, I told them all to be straight and sharp and strong. I together into a long curved blade with a single sharpened edge, like a kitchen knife instead of a sword, with small bright steel posts to hold the wooden hilt across it. Kasha picked it up and balanced it across her hands, and then she nodded once and put it down under the seat. We were 3 days on the road, the mountains growing steadily overnight, comforting in the distance. The oxen made a good pace, but we still had to duck behind hedges and hillocks and abandoned cottages every time riders went by, a steady stream of them. At first I was only glad whenever we managed to hide from them, too busy with fear and relief to think anything more about it. But while we peered over a hedge, watching a cloud vanishing away ahead, Kasha said, "They keep coming." And a cold, hard knot settled into the bottom of my stomach as I realized there had been too many of them just to be passing the word to look for us. Eric had ordered the mountain passes closed. If his men had blockaded the tower, if they'd gone after Sarkhan himself, taking him by surprise while he fought to hold the wood off from Zatachek, there wasn't anything to do but keep going. But the mountains weren't a comfort anymore. We didn't know what we would find when we got to the other side. Kasha rode in the back of the cart with the children all that day as the road began to gently climb into the foothills, her hand on the sword hidden beneath her cloak. The sun climbed high, warm golden light shining full on her face. She looked remote and strange, inhumanly steady. We reached the top of a hill and found the final crossroads in the yellow marshes, a small well beside it with a watering trough. The road was empty, although it had been trampled heavily on both sides by feet and horses. I couldn't guess if it was only ordinary traffic or not. And then I mixed some fresh mud to patch up the oxen. They cracked here and there after a day's walking. Stashek silently brought me handfuls of muddy grass. We told the children as gently as we could about their father. Marisha didn't quite understand, except to be afraid. She'd asked for her mother a few times already. Now she clung to Kasha's skirts almost all the time, like a smaller child, and didn't go out of sight of her. Stashek understood too well. He'd received the news in silence, and afterwards he said to me, "Did Uncle Marek try to have us killed?" "I'm not a child," he added, looking at my face, as if I needed him to say so when he'd just asked me such a thing. "No," I managed through my tight throat. "He's only letting the wood drive him." I wasn't sure Stashek believed me. He'd been quiet ever since. He was patient with Marisha, who clung to him too, and helped with the work whenever he could, but he said almost nothing. "Agnieszka," he said, while I finished plastering up the second oxen's hind leg and stood up to go wash the dirt off my hands. I turned to follow his gaze. We could see a long way back behind us, miles and miles. In the west, a thick, hazy cloud of dust covered the road. It seemed to move, coming onward as we stood watching. Kasia picked Marisha up. I shaded my eyes and squinted against the sun. It was a crowd of men marching, thousands of them. A stand of tall spears glittered at the front, among riders on horses and a great banner flying white and red. I saw a bay horse leading, a silver-armoured figure on its back. Next to it, a grey horse with a white-cloaked rider. The wheel tilted askew. Narrow rushed in on me. Solya's face leapt vividly out. He was looking right at me. I jerked my head away so hard that I fell down. "Yeshka?" Kasia said. "Quick!" I panted, scrambling up, pushing Stashek towards the back of the cart. "He saw me!" We drove into the mountains. I tried to guess how far behind us the army was. I would have whipped the oxen if that would have done any good, but they were going as fast as they could. The road was tumbled with rocks, narrow and twisting, and their legs began to crack and crumble quickly. There wasn't any mud to patch them with anymore, even if I could have brought myself to stop. I didn't dare use the quickening spell. I couldn't see beyond the next turn. What if there were men up ahead, and I whisked us straight into their arms? Or worse yet, I threw us mid-air over a canyon. The left ox abruptly tumbled forward, its leg crumbling away and smashed into clods of dirt. The second one pulled us on a little farther, and then between one step and next just fell apart. The cart tipped forward, unbalanced, and we all came down hard in our seats in a pile of twigs and dry grass. We were deep in the mountains by then, the trees wizened and scrubby, and high peaks on either side of the twisting road. We couldn't see far enough behind us to tell how close the army were. Usually it was a day's walk across the pass. Kasia picked up Marisha, and Stashek got to his feet. He walked beside me doggedly, uncomplaining while we hurried, feet sore and the sharp, thin air painful in our throats. We stopped to catch our breath by a jutting outcrop with a tiny summer stream trickling, just enough to cup a handful for our mouths. And as I straightened up, a raucous cawing near my head made me jump. A black crow with glossy feathers stared at me from the branch of a wizened tree clinging between rocks. It cawed again, loudly. The crow paced us as we fled, hopping from branch to rock to rock. I threw a pebble at it, trying to make it go away. It only jumped away and cawed again, a sour, triumphant note. Two more joined it a little farther on. The path snaked along the crest of the ridge, green grass rolling gently away to either side down to steep slopes. We kept running. The path dived as one mountain pulled away from it, leaving a sickening drop to the right. Maybe we were past the peak by now. I couldn't stop running long enough to think about it properly. I nearly dragged Stashek along by his arm. Somewhere behind us, I heard a hoarse shriek, as if it had slipped, running too fast on the narrow mountain pass. The crows lifted into the air, circling, and went to go and see, all except for our one steady companion, hopping along, its bright eyes fixed on us. And the sun was sinking. "Stop!" someone far behind us shouted, and an arrow sailed down, clattering against the rocks over our head. Kasia stopped and pushed Marisha into my arms when I caught up to her and took the place at the rear. Stashek threw a frightened look back at me. "Keep going," I said. "Keep going until you see the tower." Stashek pelted on and vanished with the trail around a wall of rock. I heaved Marisha up close next to me, her arms wrapping tight around my neck and her legs around my waist, clinging, and ran after him. The horses were so close we could hear pebbles crunching under their hooves. "I can see it!" Stashek was calling from up ahead. "Hold on tight," I told Marisha, and ran as fast as I could, her body bumping against me. She tucked her cheek down against my shoulder and didn't speak. Stashek turned anxiously as I came panting around the curve. He was standing on a ledge jutting out from the mountainside, almost wide enough to be a meadow. My legs were spent. I spilled to the ground, just barely keeping my knees long enough to put Marisha down without falling on top of her. We'd come out onto the southern slopes. Below us, the path continued to snake back and forth across the mountain, all the way down to Elshanka. And on the other side of the town, in front of the western mountains, the dragon's tower stood gleaming white in the sun, still small and far away. It was ringed around with soldiers, a small army of men in yellow surcoats. I stared at it desperately. Had they gotten inside? The great doors were still closed. There was no smoke coming from the windows. I didn't want to believe the tower had fallen. I wanted to shout Sarkhan's name. I wanted to fling myself across the yawning air. I got back up on my feet. Kasha had stopped in the narrow road behind us. She drew out the sword I'd given her, even as the horses came around the curve. Marek was with them, leading. His spurs were wet with blood, and he had his sword drawn, his teeth bared in a snarl. His bay came charging, and Kasha didn't move. Her hair was flying loose, streaming in the wind. She planted her feet wide in the trail and held the sword out straight, and Marek had to yank aside the horse's head or ride directly onto the blade. He pulled up, but smashed his own sword down at her as he twisted the horse on the narrow path. Kasha caught the blow and whacked it aside with pure brute strength. She knocked the sword straight out of Marek's hand. It struck the edge of the path and fell over, disappearing down the mountainside with a wash of pebbles and dust. "A pike!" Marek shouted, and a soldier threw him one. He caught it easily, even as he wheeled his horse around on the path. He brought the pike around in a long, low sweep that nearly caught Kasha at the waist. She had to jump back. If he could knock her off the path, it wouldn't matter that she was stronger than he was. She tried to grab for the end of the pike, but Marek jerked it back too quickly. Then he immediately nudged his horse forward and pulled it up into a crow-stepping rear, iron-shod hooves lashing towards her head. He was herding her back. As soon as he reached the place where the road widened, he and the other soldiers would spill out and surround her. They could come past her, at us, at the children. I groped for the dragon spell, the transport spell. Valisu and Sokinesh. But even while I tried to fit the words together, I knew somehow that it wasn't going to work. We weren't in the valley yet. The path wasn't open to us. My head was light with thin air and desperation. Stashek had picked up Marisha and was holding her tight. I shut my eyes and spoke the illusion spell. I called up Sarkhan's library, shelves rising out of the bare rock around us, golden lettered spines and the smell of leather. The clockwork bird in its cage, the window looking out on the whole green length of the valley and the winding river. I even saw us in the illusion, tiny ant figures on the mountainside moving. There was a line of 20 men strung out on the trail behind Marek. If he could only shove his way into the wider ground, they would be on us. I knew the dragon wasn't there. He was in the east, in Zatocek, where the thin column of smoke rose from the edge of the wood. But I put him in the library anyway, at the table, the hard angles of his face lit by the candles that never melted, looking at me with that annoyed, baffled expression. "Now what are you doing?" "Help me," I said to him, and gave Stashek a push. The dragon put his hands out automatically, and the children tumbled into them together. Stashek cried out, and I saw him stare up at the dragon with wide eyes. Sarkhan stared down at him. I turned back, half in the library, half on the mountain. "Kasha!" I cried. "Go!" She shouted at me. One of the soldiers behind Marek had a clear view of me and the library behind me. He slung a bow down and stretched an arrow, taking aim. Kasha ducked under the pike and ran at Marek's horse and shoved the animal bodily back, both hands on its chest. It squealed and reared up, hopping back on its rear legs and lashing at her. Marek kicked her, snapping back her chin, and shoved the shaft of the pike down between them, just behind her ankle. He had both hands on the pike now. He dropped his reins, but somehow he made the horse do what he wanted anyway. The animal turned, he twisted his body as it did, gripping the pike, and he tripped Kasia up. The horse's hindquarters struck her and swept her stumbling to the edge of the path, and Marek gave a quick, massive heave. She fell over. She didn't even have time to scream, just gave a startled, "Oh!" and was gone, dragging a clump of glass loose as she grabbed at it. "Kasia!" I screamed. Marek turned towards me. The bowman let the arrow loose. The string twanged. Hands seized my shoulders, gripping with familiar, unexpected strength. They dragged me backwards. The walls of the library rushed forward around me and closed up just before the arrow would have passed through them. The whistle of the wind, the cold, crisp air faded from my skin. I whirled, staring. Sarkan was there. He was standing right behind me. He'd pulled me through. His hands were still on my shoulders. I was braced on his chest. I was full of alarm and 1,000 questions, but he dropped his hands and stepped back, and I realized we weren't alone. A map of the valley lay unrolled on the table, and an enormous broad-shouldered man with a beard longer than his head and a shirt of mail under a yellow surcoat stood at the far end of it, gawking at us, with 4 armoured men behind him, gripping the hilts of their swords. "Kasia!" I wanted Kasia too. I was still shaking with the memory of watching her tumble over the edge. How far could she fall without being heard? I ran to the window. We were far away, but I could see the thin plume of dust where she'd fallen, like a line drawn down the side of the mountain. She was a tiny, dark heap of brown cloak and golden hair on the trail, 100 feet down where it sloped back on itself down the mountain. I tried to gather my wits and my magic. My legs still shook with exhaustion. "No," Sarkan said, coming to my side. "Stop. I don't know how you've done any of this, and I imagine I'll be appalled when I learn, but you've been too profligate with your magic for 1 hour. He pointed his finger out the window at the tiny huddled heap of Kasia's body, his eyes narrowing. "Toile d'Aquel," he said, and clenched his hand into a fist. Jerked it quickly back and pointed his finger to an oak place on the floor. Kasia tumbled out of the air where he pointed and spilled to the floor, trailing brown dust. She rolled and got up quickly, staggering only a little. There were some bloody scrapes on her arms, but she kept hold of her sword. She took one look at the armed men on the other side of the table and caught Stashek by the shoulder. She pulled him behind her and held the sword out like a bar. "Hush, Marishu," she said, a quick touch of her hand to Marisha's cheek to quiet her. The little girl was still trying to reach for her. The big man had only been staring all this while. He said suddenly, "God in heaven. Sarkan, that's the young prince." "Yes, I imagine so," Sarkan said. He sounded resigned. I stared at him, still half disbelieving he was really there. He was thinner than when I'd seen him last, and almost as dishevelled as I was. Soot streaked his cheek and neck, and had left a fine thin layer of grey all over his skin, enough that a line showed at the loose collar of his shirt where it gaped open to divide clean skin from dirty. He wore a rough, long coat of leather hanging open. The edges of the sleeves and the bottom hem were singed black, and the whole length of it patterned with scorch marks. He looked as though he'd come straight from burning the wood. I wondered wildly if I'd somehow summoned him here with my spell. Peering from behind Kasia, Stashek said, "Baron Vladimir?" He hitched Marisha up a little in his arms, protectively, and looked at Sarkan. "Are you the dragon?" he said, his high, young voice wavering and doubtful, as if thinking he didn't quite look the part. "Agnieszka brought us here to keep us safe," he added, even more doubtfully. Of course she did, Sarkhan said. He looked out the window. Marek and his men were already riding down the sloping trail, and not alone. The long marching line of the army was coming out of the mountain pass, their feet raising a sunset golden cloud of dust that rolled down towards Olshanka like a fog. The dragon turned back to me. Well, he said, caustic, you've certainly brought more men. Chapter 26. He must have scraped together every soldier in the south of Polnya, the Baron of the Yellow Marshes said, studying Marek's army. He was a big, comfortably barrel-bellied man who wore his armour as easily as cloth. He wouldn't have seemed out of place in our village tavern. He'd just gotten the summons to come to the capital for the king's funeral when Marek's magic-sped messenger had arrived, told him that the crown prince was dead too, and gave him his orders to go over the mountains, seize Sarkhan as corrupted and a traitor, and lay a trap for me and the children. The Baron nodded, gave orders for his soldiers to gather, and waited until the messenger had left. Then he'd brought his men over the pass and gone straight to Sarkhan to tell him there was some kind of corrupt devilry going on at court. They'd come back to the tower together, and those were his soldiers encamped below. They were hastily putting up fortifications for a defence. But we can't hold out longer than a day, not against that, the Baron said, jerking his thumb out the window at the army pouring down the mountainside. So you'd better have something up your sleeve. I told my wife to write to Marek that I'd lost my mind and gone corrupted, so I hope he won't behead her and the children, but I'd as soon keep my own head too. If they try long enough, Sarkhan said, and the walls for that matter. He pointed to a pair of wooden carts trundling down the mountainside, carrying the long iron barrels of cannon. Enchantment won't hold against cannon fire forever. He turned away from the window. You know we've already lost, he said to me bluntly. Every man we kill, every spell and potion we waste, it all serves the wood. We could take the children to their mother's family and marshal a fresh defence in the north, around Gidna. He wasn't saying anything I didn't know, hadn't known even when I'd come flying home like a bird to its burning nest. No, I said. Listen to me, he said. I know your heart is in this valley. I know you can't let it go, because I'm bound to it, I said sharply. Me and all the other girls you chose. I tumbled into his library with an army at my heels and half a dozen people around us, and there hadn't been time for conversation, but I still hadn't forgiven him. I wanted to get him alone and shake him until answers came out, and shake him a little more for good measure. He fell silent, and I forced myself to push aside that hot anger. I knew this wasn't the time. That's not why, I said instead. The wood could reach into the king's castle in Kralia, a week's journey from here. Do you think there's anywhere we can take the children that the wood can't reach? At least here we have a chance of victory. But if we run, if we let the wood take back the whole valley, we'll never raise an army anywhere that can fight all the way through to its heart. Unfortunately, he said, sharp, the one we have now is pointing the wrong way. Then we need to persuade Marek to turn it around, I said. Kasia and I took the children down to cellars, the safest place, and we made up a pallet for them of straw and spare blankets from the shelves. The kitchen stores were untouched by time, and we were all hungry enough after our day of running that not even worry could stifle our appetite. I took a rabbit from the cold store in back and put it in a pot with some carrots and dried buckwheat and water, and threw living talem at it to make it into something edible. We all wolfed it down together without bothering with bowls, and almost at once the children collapsed into an exhausted sleep, curled together. "I'll stay with them," Kasia said, sitting down beside the pallet. She put her sword unsheathed next to her and rested a hand on Marisha's sleeping head. I mixed up a simple dough in a big bowl, just flour paste and salt, and I carried it upstairs to the library. Outside, the soldiers had put up Marek's tent, a white pavilion with 2 tall spell lamps planted in the ground before it. Their blue light gave the white fabric an unearthly glow, as though the whole pavilion had descended straight from heaven, which I imagine was the idea. The king's banner was snapping in the wind atop the highest point, the red eagle with its mouth and its talons open, crowned. The sun was sinking. The long shadow of the western mountains was creeping slowly over the valley. A herald came out and stood between the lamps, official and stark in his white uniform, with a heavy golden chain of office around his neck. Another piece of Ragostok's working. It threw his voice against the tower walls like a blast of righteous trumpets. He was recounting all our crimes: corruption, treason, murdering the king, murdering Princess Malgorzata, murdering Father Ballo, conspiring with the traitor Alosha, the abduction of Prince Casimir Stanislav Algierdon and Princess Regalinda Maria Algierdon. It took me a moment to realise they meant Stashek and Marisha, consorting with the enemies of Polya and going on from there. I was glad to hear them name Alosha a traitor. Maybe that meant she was still alive. The list finished with a demand for the return of the children and our immediate surrender. Afterwards, the herald paused for a breath and to take a drink of water. Then he began to recite the gruesome litany all over again. The Baron's men milled uneasily around the base of the tower where they were encamped and looked up askance towards our windows. "Yes, Marek seems eminently persuadable," Sarkin said as he came into the room. Faint smears of oil glistened on his throat and the back of his hand and across his forehead. He had been brewing up potions of sleep and forgetfulness in his laboratory. "What do you mean to do with that? I doubt Marek is going to eat a poisoned loaf of bread, if that was your notion." I turned my dough out onto the smooth marble top of the long table. I had the vague thought of the oxen in my head, the way I'd cobbled them together. They'd crumbled, but they'd only been made of mud. "Do you have any sand?" I asked. "And maybe some small pieces of iron?" I kneaded iron shavings and sand into my dough while the herald chanted on outside. Sarkin sat across from me, his pen scratching out a long incantation of illusion and dismay put together from his books. An hourglass streamed sand between us, marking time while his potions brewed. A few unhappy soldiers from the Baron were waiting for him while he worked, shifting from foot to foot uneasily in the corner of the room. He put down his pen just as the last few grains of sand spilled, precisely timed. "All right, come with me," he told them, and took them along to the laboratory to give them the flasks to carry downstairs. But I hummed my mother's baking songs while I worked, folding and folding in a steady rhythm. I thought of Alosha, forging her blade again and again, working a little more magic in each time. When my dough was pliable and smooth, I broke off a piece, rolled it into a tower in my hands, and planted it in the middle, folding up the dough on one side to make the wall of the mountains behind us. Sarkin came back into the room and scowled down at my work. "A charming model," he said. "I'm sure the children will be entertained." "Come and help me," I said. I pinched up a wall around the tower out of soft dough and started to murmur a chant of earth spells over it. Fulmedesh, Fulmishtar, back and forth in a steady rhythm. I built a second wall farther out, then a third. I kept humming softly to them. A groaning sound like trees in a high wind came in from outside the window, and the floor trembled faintly beneath us, earth and stone waking up. Sarkhan watched, frowning a little while longer. I felt his eyes on the back of my neck. The memory curled in me of the last time we'd worked together in this room, roses and thorns sprawling furiously everywhere between us. I wanted and didn't want his help. I wanted to stay angry at him a while longer, but I wanted the connection more. I wanted to touch him, wanted the brilliant, crisp bite of his magic in my hands. I kept my head down and kept working. He turned and went to one of his cabinets. He brought over a small drawer full of chips of stone that looked like the same grey granite as the tower, of varied sizes. He began to gather the chips up and with his long fingers pressed them into the walls I had built. He recited a spell of repairing a spell of mending cracks and patching stone. His magic came running through the clay, vivid and bright where it brushed against mine. He brought the stone into the spell, laying the deep foundations beneath, lifting me and my working higher, like putting steps beneath me so I could take the walls up into clear air. I drew his magic into my working, running my hands back along the walls, my chant still marching away beneath the melody of his spell. I darted a quick glance at him. He was staring down at the dough, trying to keep his scowl, and flushed at the same time with the high, transcendent light that he brought to his elaborate workings, delighted and also annoyed, trying not to be. Outside, the sun had gone down. A faint blue-violet glow flickered over the surface of the dough like strong liquor burning off in a pot. I could just barely make it out in the dim twilight of the room. Then the working went up like dry kindling. There was a jolt, a rush of magic, but this time Sarkhan was ready for the dam bursting. Even as the spell caught, he pulled abruptly back from me. Instinctively, I reached after him at first, but then I pulled back too. We fell away into our separate skins instead of spilling magic all over each other. A cracking noise like winter ice breaking in came through the window, and shouts rose. I hurried past Sarkhan, my face hot, to go and look. The spell lamps outside Marek's tent were rolling slowly up and down as if they were lanterns on boats climbing a wave. The ground was shuddering like water. The Baron's men all backed hastily to the tower walls. Their thin fence work, little more than heaped bundles of sticks they'd gathered, was falling apart. In the spell light, I saw Marek come ducking out of his tent, gold chain the herald had been wearing, gripped in his fist. A scurrying crowd of men and servants poured out behind him, escaping. The whole great pavilion was collapsing. "Put out the torches and the fires," Marek bellowed, his voice unnaturally loud. The earth groaned and rumbled all around with complaining voices. Solya came out of the pavilion with the others. He seized one of the spell lamps out of the ground and held it up with a sharp word that brightened it. The ground between the tower and the encampment was heaved and hunched up like some complaining lazy beast getting to its feet. Stone and earth began to rear themselves into 3 high walls around the tower, made of fresh quarried stone laced full of white veins and jagged edges. Marek had to give orders for his men to pull the cannon back quickly, the rising walls pulling the ground out from under their feet. The ground settled, sighing out like ripples, and died away. Small showers of dirt and pebbles ran off the walls. Marek's face in the light was baffled and furious. For one moment, he looked up straight at me, glaring. I glared right back. Sarkhan dragged me away from the window. "You won't persuade Marek to listen any sooner by provoking him into a high rage," he said when I wheeled on him, forgetting to be embarrassed in my anger. We were standing very close. He noticed the same moment that I did. He let go of me abruptly and stepped back. He looked aside and put up his hand to wipe a trickle of sweat from the side of his forehead. He said, "We'd better go down and tell Vladimir that he needn't worry. We aren't planning to drop him and all his soldiers into the centre of the earth." "You might have warned us ahead of time," the Baron said dryly when we came outside, "but I won't complain too much. We can make him pay for these walls more than he can afford, as long as we can move between them ourselves. The stones are cutting up our ropes. We need a way through." He wanted us to make 2 tunnels at opposite ends of the walls from each other, so he could make Marek fight the whole length of the walls to get through each one. Sarkan and I went to the northern end to begin. The soldiers were already laying pikes along the wall by torchlight, with the points bristling upward. They had draped cloaks over the poles to make small tents to sleep under. A few of them were sitting around small campfires, soaking dried meat in boiling water, stirring kasha into the broth to cook up. They cleared hastily out of our way without our even having to say a word, afraid. Sarkan seemed not to notice, but I couldn't help feeling sorry and strange and wrong. One of the soldiers was a boy my own age, industriously sharpening pike heads one by one with a stone, skillfully. 6 strokes for each one and done, as quick as the 2 men putting them along the wall could come back for them. He must have put himself to it to learn how to do it so well. He didn't look sullen or unhappy. He'd chosen to go for a soldier. Maybe he had a story that began that way. A poor widowed mother at home and 3 young sisters to feed, and a girl from down the lane who smiled at him over the fence as she drove her father's herd out into the meadows every morning. So he'd given his mother his signing money and gone to make his fortune. He'd worked hard. He meant to be a corporal soon, and after that a sergeant. He'd go home then in his fine uniform and put silver into his mother's hands and ask the smiling girl to marry him. Or maybe he'd lose a leg and go home sorrowful and bitter to find her married to a man who could farm. Or maybe he'd take to drink to forget that he'd killed men in trying to make himself rich. That was a story too. They all had stories. They had mothers or fathers, sisters or lovers. They weren't alone in the world, mattering to no one but themselves. It seemed utterly wrong to treat them like pennies in a purse. I wanted to go and speak to that boy, to ask him his name, to find out what his story really was. But that would have been dishonest, a sop to my own feelings. I felt the soldiers understood perfectly well that we were making sums out of them. This many safe to spend, this number too high, as if each one wasn't a whole man. Sarkan snorted. What good would it do them for you to roam around them asking questions, so you know this one's from Debna, and that one father is a tailor, and the other one has 3 children at home? They're better served by your building walls to keep Marek's soldiers from killing them in the morning. They'd be better served by Marek not trying in the first place, I said, impatient with him for refusing to understand. The only way we could make Marek bargain was to make the walls too costly to breach, so he wouldn't want to pay. But it still made me angry at him, at the Baron, at Sarkan, at myself. Have you got any family left? I asked him abruptly. I couldn't say, he said. I was a 3-year-old beggar child when I set fire to Varsha, trying to stay warm on the street one winter's night. They didn't bother to hunt up my family before they packed me off to the capital. He spoke indifferently, as if he didn't mind it being unmoored from all the world. Don't make mournful faces at me, he added. That was 1.5 centuries ago, and 5 kings have breathed their last since then. 6 he added, he amended. Come here and help me find a crack to open. It was full dark by then, and no way of finding any crack except by touch. I put my hand on the wall and almost jerked it back again. The stone murmured so strangely under my fingers, a chorus of deep voices. I looked closer. We had turned up more than bare rock and earth. There were broken pieces of carved blocks jutting up from the dirt, the bones of the old lost tower. Ancient words were carved upon them in places, faint and nearly worn away, but still there to be felt, even if not seen. I took my hands away and rubbed them against each other. My fingers felt dusty, dry. They're long gone, Sarkhan said, but the echoes lingered. The wood had thrown down that last tower. The wood had devoured and scattered all those people. Maybe it had happened like this for them too. Maybe they turned and twisted into weapons against one another until all of them were dead and the roots of the wood could quietly creep over their bodies. I put my hands back on the stone. Sarkhan had found a narrow crack in the wall, barely wide enough for fingertips. We took hold of it on opposite sides and pulled together. Fulmedesh, I said, as he made a spell of opening, and between us the crack widened with a sound like plates breaking on a stone floor. A crumbling waterfall of pebbles came pouring out. The soldiers dug out the loose stones with their helmets and their gauntleted hands while we pulled the crack still wider. When we were done, the tunnel was just big enough for a man in armour to get through if he stooped. Inside, the faint gleams of silvery blue letters shone here and there out of the dark. I scurried through the mouse hole of it as quickly as I could, trying not to look at them. The soldier began working in the trench behind us while we walked all the long curve of the wall to the southern end to make the second opening. By the time we finished the second tunnel, Marek's men had begun to try the outer wall, not very seriously yet. They were lobbing over burning rags soaked in lamp oil, small thorny bits of iron with spikes pointing in every direction. But that almost made the Baron's soldiers happier. They stopped watching me and Sarkhan like we were poisonous snakes and began comfortably bawling out orders and making siege preparations, work they all plainly knew well. There wasn't a place for us among them. We were only in their way. I didn't try to speak to any of them after all. I silently followed the dragon back to the tower. He shut the great doors behind us, the thump of the bar falling into the iron braces echoing against the marble. The entry and the great hall were unchanged. The unwelcoming narrow wooden benches standing against the walls, the hanging lamps above. Everything as stiff and formal as the first day I'd come wandering through here with my tray of food, so frightened and alone. Even the Baron preferred to sleep outside with his men in the warm weather. I could hear their voices outside through the arrow-slit windows, but only faintly, as if they came from far away. Some of the soldiers were singing a song together, a bawdy song probably, but full of glad working rhythm. I couldn't make out the words. "We'll have a little quiet, at least," Sarkhan said, turning from the doors towards me. He wiped a hand across his forehead, streaking a clean line through the fine layer of grey stone dust clinging to his skin. His hands were stained with green powder and iridescent traces of oil that shone in the lamplight. He looked down at them with a grimace of distaste, at the loose sleeves of his work shirt coming unrolled. For a moment, I might have been alone in the tower again. Just the two of us, with no armies waiting outside, no royal children hiding in the cellar, with the shadow of the wood falling across our door. I forgot I was trying to be angry with him. I wanted to go into his arms and press my face into his chest and breathe him in, smoke and ash and sweat all together. I wanted to shut my eyes and have him put his arms around me. I wanted to rub handprints through his dust. Sarkhan, I said. They'll most likely attack at the first light of morning, he said too quickly, cutting me off before I could say anything more. His face was as closed up as the doors. He stepped back from me and gestured at the stairs. The best thing you can do at the moment is get some sleep.
He's very...
I just, for the first time ever, had this thought of how sometimes she's thinking about some things, she's ruminating, like when she was thinking about the stories of the soldiers, and the dragon interrupts her thoughts like he's reading her mind.
He's done
He
that quite a
also can
lot.
read her mind when she's all horny about him, right?
When they're doing magic together.
I think it's just a kind of convention of the writing more. I think that, like, rather than having her just like a bunch of dialogue, I think sometimes, because I've noticed this as well, that sometimes she'll like be thinking something and then someone will reply to her, and so I think it's just that she's like spoken it, but we haven't kind of heard the words in the text.
Maybe she thinks really loudly.
Maybe she thinks very loudly, yeah. Although I do like the idea that he can read her thoughts and she's just like
Not when they're doing together. When they're doing magic together, or is it just all the time?
I think it's not just with her, because I think it's with Kasha as well. She's done it a couple of times with Kasha, where she's like thought a thing and Kasha's been like, yes, but what about this? But then her and Kasha
meant to be together.
also, yeah, exactly. Ship it.
Notice that her Agnieszka's magic seemed to pick up much quicker than the Willow had suggested when she went outside. When she went to the riverbank and everything, as in, like, she wasn't as exhausted from the magic within her.
It made me laugh how... I was going to say, it made me laugh. Go after you, mate. Okay. Yeah.
4 or 5 people.
He's special.
I thought it was funny how when she... because the writing's been perfect all the way through the book, but then it just sounded like just a little bit lazy when she... And I just threw some stuff on the lake, and it was like...
It's just like, yeah, I just tied some reeds together and threw it down, and then there was a boat.
Not bothered.
It feels like she's becoming much more intuitive over time. Like the act of using her magic is becoming more intuitive to her.
Yeah.
Using the book less.
Yeah.
Thread is very important.
Not that she used the book very much anyway.
Just as a person, thread is super important.
Michael is here. Michael has come back.
Hello.
Hiya, Michael.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Michael.
Happy birthday.
Malcolm, how would you feel about doing a birthday poem for Michael?
I'll absolutely do that. I'm gonna have to find it on my phone again.
How exciting.
You might need to adjust your laptop or mic or whatever so that we can hear you a bit better. At least I can. I hear you very well.
Testing. Is this clearer?
That's better.
That sounds better. Okay, 1 second, and let me just mute everybody and then unmute you. Okay. Ready when you are, my love.
Okay. For Michael Bro, on your birthday. The Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome wraths outgrieve. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumious banders. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabtious day, calloo, callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wave. Old Mimsy were the borogold, and the mum rats out.
Yay! That was so lovely.
Thank you. Happy birthday to me.
Happy birthday, Michael.
Thank you.
Oh, I wish I could hug you.
How's your
Me
day
too.
been doing?
I wasn't actually necessarily going to do a Scottish accent, but there you go.
It went great.
Yeah.